Welcome to the Higher Ed Demand Gen podcast, helping higher education marketing leaders share knowledge about learning, strategies, and tactics that are relevant today. See what you can learn today by listening to one of our episodes.
Okay, so for today's episode, we're actually going to be playing back a recording for a webinar and guest panelist discussion I recently hosted at Concept 3D on the topic of student success solutions, retention, and persistence. The goal really is to talk through strategies, ideas, and tactics to improve student success and student retention with some expert guest speakers. We'll talk about what you should stop doing and also some innovative strategies our guest speakers have lined up. For our guest speakers, we got Aaron Basco, the VP for Enrollment Management at University of Lynchburg, Gil Rogers, who is the host of the For Your Institution podcast. He's also a consultant at GR7 Marketing. And last but not least, we got John Andrick, who is the Assistant Dean of Students and the Director of the Center for Student Success at Concordia College. It's a great discussion, extremely engaging. I think it went really well, and so I hope it provides a lot of value for you folks who are really focused on retaining students and giving students a reason to stay at their institution and persist through their higher ed experience. So follow along as we tune in. A quick goal and agenda. So today, with our guest speakers, I'd really love to talk through some strategies, ideas, and tactics to improve student success and student retention, as well as student persistence as a whole. And in order to reach those goals, I've actually worked with the three guests ahead of time to highlight 6 key questions that we hope to have a discussion on today. I'll also be sharing an onboarding success pyramid. It's a framework we came up here with Concept 3D, a little bit more oriented towards orientation and first year experience, but we hope to kind of align some of the conversations with this onboarding success pyramid. And we'll also have a Q&A, some Q&A time at the end where we can do some maybe live workshopping as well. Fantastic. And before we get started, I wanted to just talk about some trends in higher ed that I've looked up, and Gail also was kind enough to share with me. So wanted to do a quick overview of what we're seeing. And most of these results are coming from the National Student Clearinghouse Research Center. So the trends here are actually very encouraging. So since the pandemic, both retention rate and persistence is on an upward trend and tick. And just to define the two things and the difference, at least for this presentation, the retention rates are equal to the portion of students who are re-enrolled at the following fall at the original and same institution. Persistence rates are the portion of students who re-enrolled the following fall at any institution. So think transfer students. And then as a whole, nearly 76% of the 2.4 million students who started college in the fall of 21 returned for their second year. So the persistent rate actually marks a 1-year increase of almost a full point. And it's actually a return back to pre-pandemic levels. So, good news, right? And also an interesting thing was the latest persistence rate growth. So over the last year of data was driven by a higher share of students returning to their first original institution. So increase in retention rates is what drove the overall persistence rates, which is a shift from the previous year where students were actually transferring out more, and that's what drove the persistence rates. So if you're working in retention at an institution right now, also a great upward tick as well, meaning that you're retaining more of your original students. The flip side of all this is the trend is great to see, right? But if you look at the other side of 67% and 76%, that still means 33% of students on average are dropping out from your specific institution, and 23% of students are dropping out from continuing their higher education as a whole. So that's a lot. What I see is a lot of opportunity left on the table. And I'd love for that to kind of be the start of our discussion here today. And just a quick intro. My name is Shiro Hattori, and I work for Concept 3D, and we are hosting this online event and webinar today. I also host a podcast called the Higher Ed Demand Gen podcast as well, where we talk about marketing, communications, enrollment marketing as well. So, we're providing a lot of value to higher ed. And we believe here, as a higher ed tech partner with over 600 happy higher ed customers, we believe that student success holds a greater significance than ever before, right? Institutions' success in keeping their existing students enrolled and progressing will be increasingly important, especially as demographic trends portray a decrease in the number of traditional age students flowing into higher ed. In short, the enrollment cliff. So we understand the impact of student success solutions and how they will play out as a significant role in a student's life cycle, especially towards retention, and for the industry towards persistence. And with that, we recently actually developed a white paper on student onboarding and student retention success. And we came up with this framework, which is based on Maslow's hierarchy, but shifted towards student needs. So we call this as our onboarding success pyramid. And at the very bottom, right, we have logistics and detail. This is basic needs like residence, housing, food, water, understanding of space and place. To the next level, we have guidance and mentorship, right? Connecting students early on with staff, counselors, faculty, other mentors, and providing, communicating all the resources also effectively so that you really understand the different student needs based on, the different demographics they fit into. On top of that, we have community connections, creating a sense of belonging through different groups and engagement, whether that is events, clubs, or activities. And at the very top, we have individual fulfillment. This will come over time, right? This doesn't happen usually during onboarding or even first year student success, and maybe not even at graduation, right? Especially if a student knows they want to continue on to grad school or beyond. But this is the pinnacle of what we're trying to reach. And one point that we want to make here is that if you don't have any of the layers below your pyramid, you are successful with anything above, regardless, you won't be able to meet a student's needs because you need each layer to be filled. Otherwise, your student life will fall out underneath you. So I thought sharing this framework to start out would be great, so we can kind of tie some conversations and where they actually, where programs and different campaigns the panelists are thinking of and talking about can fit into those specific areas of student needs. Fantastic. All right, and with that, let's move on to question one. So, we'll start with the why here. Why focus on student success, retention, and persistence? And I want to call on each one of our guest speakers today, and I'll start with you, Gil.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for having me and including me in this conversation with these esteemed guests. I really do appreciate it. I think that for most of the folks who are listening into this conversation, I think we'd all agree that there are institutional reasons why student success and retention matter, and then there's student reasons that student success matters. And at the end of the day, it should be two parts to the same coin, right? I think that there are, and for folks that work in higher education, we are very mission driven and care about the success of students, unlike any other industry that people might be working in. Because at the end of the day, if we consider students to be customers, right, it's more affordable to keep a current customer than it is to go out and find new customers. And I think something that the industry as a whole has started to understand over the past few years is that fact, right? And for the longest time, it was go find more students, go recruit more students, just fill the top of the funnel and everything will work out. Then the pandemic happened, which resulted in the bottoming out of retention and persistence rates. So then there's been laser focused on solving that problem. We're seeing that positive trend, right? And Shiro, as you mentioned, there's still plenty of work to be done. I wouldn't celebrate necessarily a C+ on a report card. I would say, great, that's improvement. Now, how do we get to a B+, A-, right? But at the end of the day, I think from an institutional health perspective, and more importantly, achieving our vision for higher ed as a whole, retention matters, because if we keep students in our ecosystem, they're going to persist and complete their degree, which then sets them up for success in their future career and all of the benefits that we know about, right? And so I think for me, from the institutional perspective, I think that's definitely where that sits.
So yeah, John or Aaron, do you want to jump in here as well?
Sure, I will. So I, definitely, as Gil was saying, I think this is the point at which our vision of success really aligns with our students and their parents and their vision of success, right? I mean, we all want the same thing for our students for multiple reasons. We want to be able to certainly say that we are, graduating successful, happy students who go out into the world and bring our mission out into the world. And I think on the really practical side, as we have seen such a contraction in the, student college going population, and we'll continue to see that over the next little bit. And the competition is so high, it's really hard to go out and just add additional students. And what we now are really thinking is we need to go back and adjust what we're doing so that our success level with our client customer is higher. I think that would not be, in other industries, that would not be a rate of customer, retention and success that we would be as excited about. So I think, for both for our ability to deliver on our promise and certainly the revenue considerations that come with that, retention is the obvious place for us to look to try to do better.
Thank you.
I'll just echo what the others have said too, and reinforce this, that it's so much more valuable for us to keep the students that we already have versus trying to go out and find more new students in a market that's competitive and borderline saturated, and fewer students available, and all the kinds of things that we all, I think, know very well. I'm also a big believer that the value in higher ed is really in finishing. That persistence through that full degree plan and getting to the end, and having that benchmark of a degree under your belt, whether it's an associate's degree or a bachelor's degree or beyond. Starting is great, finishing is better. So if we can be really focused on helping students continue and finishing and getting the full value of that experience, then I think that meets with our missions and our sort of reasons why we got into higher ed in the first place.
Yeah, and sure, just one thing as we round out this point, because I wanted to circle back to something I mentioned before. It's okay to care about hitting the revenue targets for the institution and care about that, because that's your livelihood, it's your job, right? But it's also, we don't have to separate that from caring about delivering the value of the outcomes that we're looking for. And this is something that higher ed can do that most in other industries can't, is really think about putting that student first in that process. And this goes up a level. If you brought the right students to your institution, now you're going to bring in, and they are a good fit for the institution. Now, all of the items that you mentioned in your framework with the onboarding success pyramid makes sense, right? And it's a lot easier to get to that individual fulfillment level when you're keeping the student success at your forefront, which then the tuition goals follow.
Yeah, that's a really great point, Gil. I actually had a different statistic before this morning, that I think students who drop out end up on average making like 33% less than students that do complete their institution. So, one thing was, as an institution, like ensuring the promise that you're making as an institution to help students complete their education does have a net benefit on their life. So yeah, that was one thing that popped up to me with your comment, John.
And not only do they make less, but they often have debt that they've accumulated from a partial education, which is sort of the worst situation, right? So
Yep. Yeah, that's a great point as well. Fantastic. I'll move on to question number 2. So before we start into strategies, John made a great point. Like, what are some observations over the last couple of years that you've seen in programs and campaigns that you could recommend stop doing? And this could be from experience or what you're seeing in the industry. And John, do you actually want to kick us off here?
Yeah, sure. Happy to jump in. So, I think we are guilty of prescribing to that sort of cult of busy in the work that we do. And I think oftentimes when we don't see the outcomes that we want, we just do more instead of thinking about what's effective, what's actually yielding the outcomes that we want. And so, I would say the number one thing I would recommend we stop doing is anything that we're not measuring the outcomes. We need to have a really good sense of if the things that we are doing are actually achieving the things that we want. do we know if this moved the needle on retention? The department that I work in, the division that I work in, we've been really clear about learning goals that we have set for students. And so we don't do things that aren't geared towards helping students meet those learning goals. Certainly we provide service to students when they come in, and not everything is a learning opportunity, but any programming that we do has to have those learning goals attached to it. And then it has to have an assessment to see if we're actually meeting those things. So we have to be able to identify the things that aren't working so that we can stop doing them. And so that we don't get stuck in that cult of more or that cult of busy and just keep layering things on top of one another. That also makes it that much more difficult to determine what is and isn't working anyways. So that would be the number one thing I would recommend you stop doing, is anything that you're not measuring the outcomes on. Stop doing those things.
I think
Really great point.
I would also focus on, I think one of the traps that we fall into with retention is you're trying to figure out, like, what's the thing that we need to prevent happening, right? And what you find from, if you do any kind of survey work, is there isn't just one thing usually, right? There are many potential outcomes or many potential roadblocks that students can run into that might push them sort of off track. And I think we spend a lot of time often trying to control all of those possible outcomes, which I think is really not possible, right? And so instead, I think if we were able to focus on making sure that your student makes a really strong connection to the institution and, knows where to go when they need help, because inevitably something bad is going to happen, right? Some challenge is going to come up, but do they know where to connect to work through that challenge, right? Do they have a reason, a really strong reason to be here and to stay here? And so I think I'm really focused on trying to help flip the thinking from the negative, right? Like, what is it that's going wrong that we could fix to get people back to average, and flip it to a positive? Is that, like, how could we invest in the things that we value as a culture and really deeply connect students to those things, so that when the inevitable sort of slings and arrows of life come along, they've got an anchor that kind of holds them in place, that they are committed to.
Yeah, I think just to add to both of those, I think the stop doing is stop not prioritizing, right? And you've got to set and so I guess that's a start, but whatever. I feel like there's the desire to always just call every student, email every student, text message every student. And I think the reality is that we don't have the people power to do that at most institutions anymore, right? And you call it the Great Resignation, call it whatever you want. There's been issues around, and I've written about this in the past on a variety of channels, but it's like I mentioned before, we're an industry of people who are very mission driven and care deeply about supporting students, but we're also human beings that have our own lives and our own families and our own goals. And when we expect our teams to work 24/7, 365, because that's what they've been accustomed, and that's what we've been accustomed to, is having those people that don't mind being available all the time. Those people have been pushed to the brink, right? And I think that then impacts quality of service for students when we're burning out our teams, right? And so it boils back down to that, the whole idea, like John mentioned, around setting goals and sticking to those goals. Because if you have a metric that you're tied to versus just be available all the time, there's going to be a lot more value that you're driving to the students with that mindset.
Gotcha. Thank you. And to add to that, this will kind of transition into the next slide as well, but does anyone have an example of something they've had to shift because of data, or because of results they found, or because of they weren't measuring results?
Yeah, I can jump in on that. When I first started in my current role, we had a peer mentorship program on our campus that was relatively well developed and well resourced and all of those kinds of things, but nobody could really identify what was the purpose in it, what was it trying to achieve, other than sort of the big broad ideas of, oh, we're hoping to retain, we're hoping students will be more successful, but no specific outcomes tied to it. And what that program had evolved into being was sort of like the fun patrol on campus. They were throwing social events and encouraging people to go to athletic events or those types of things, which are great and those are valuable and they have their place. But with the amount of resource that was being poured into that program, it was not moving the needle on retention. It was not moving the needle on academic success. It wasn't moving the needle on improving attendance. Any of those other kinds of measures that we might have been looking for to get out of a peer support program, we weren't getting. So we had to make some difficult decisions, and we ultimately cut that program and redistributed those resources to other places and rethought what a peer support network in our first year would look like, and tied that more to the goals first that we wanted it to accomplish, and have sort of rebuilt those types of support systems from the ground up, but needed to stop doing the peer mentor thing for a couple of years, to really rethink where's the best place for us to put these resources.
Great, thanks for sharing that. Well, next let's talk about some current innovative student retention strategies that you're seeing in the market, or seeing or trying to implement at your institution today. Does anyone want to take this one next? How about you, Aaron?
Sure. That sounds good. I've been really working on, this is a problem I've been, really spending some brain time on over the last probably 12 to 15 years, right? I think as I've led some different efforts and tried different things and worked with different platforms and, lots of different approaches. And, I think different things fit different places, right? I mean, if you're a large institution, you're going to need maybe a larger, more complex system. But I think there are a lot of institutions out there who are small to medium size, who, can't really afford to bring in a gigantic platform and, kind of work with all the data and those kinds of things. And I think it's good for those institutions to think about, what it is that they do best and what got them there to begin with. So I've really been pushing my institution to say, how do you make sure that people have that sort of positive connection, right? How do you make sure that everybody on campus, every student, has somebody who's they feel like has their back, that when they need to go and talk with somebody, they can do that. There's somebody sort of in their corner doing that. And at the same time, how do you make sure that everybody has something that they feel like they belong to, right? A club, an activity, a reason to be there, right? So that if I don't show up for that, I'm going to be missed, right? And this came really clear to me. So my son he'll be starting his fourth year at an institution in Ohio, and he was in that first sort of COVID group of students to go off, right? That first full semester when we were trying to bring people back. And, I asked him about that afterwards, and I said, like, how did you make it? Wasn't it difficult? And he said, it was really difficult. He said, but the two things that got me through was, number one, I had a great RA that I felt like I could go and chat with whenever things got hard. And number two, I got really involved in intramural volleyball. And I thought, well, that's kind of funny. But the more I thought about it, the more it matched up with the research that, I've seen from like the Gallup-Purdue Index and things like that, that really this is about giving students like certain types of experiences on the positive side that give them a drive to continue. And so I've really been kind of pushing my institution to say, let's find a way to make sure everybody has like a backer, someone who's got their back, right? Mm-hmm. And is there a way that we can help that person help students to think about their lives and what kind of commitments they're making to themselves in their future? So again, when something bad comes along, they've got some resilience built up. They know that they belong. And if I leave, people on my intramural volleyball team are going to miss me, right? If I leave, the person that I go to help me out and believes in me and has helped me come up with all these commitments, they're going to be really disappointed. Maybe I need to like go and talk this through before I make any big decisions. So that's really what we've talked a lot about and been trying to focus on how to implement that as a system and a strategy.
Yeah, I think just to add a little bit to that, and this goes, Shiri, you brought this up at the beginning with your success pyramid, right? I think generally speaking, for the longest time, our student outreach when students are enrolled has been very transactional in a lot of ways, right? It's register for the next semester. It's send in your rooming deposit. Your rooming deposit. It's sign up for clubs, but there's no like proactive nature in connecting students to opportunities aside from the way things have always been done, college fair type setup or career fair type setup or a club fair type setup. And so I think that, what Aaron's hitting on is that sense of belonging aspect that students have. And, you call it community connections here, right? Which I think is really important, because once students feel like they are truly a part of that community, it is harder for them to walk away, right? Clearly, finances are a thing, right? And that's a driver that's going to impact students. But I feel like with most things, people are more willing to put in the extra work or pay a little bit more or invest a little bit more when they're truly vested in something, right? People buy Starbucks coffee because it brings them joy. It's overpriced and expensive, but it brings them joy. So they do it. And obviously I'm not equating a degree at an institution with a cup of coffee, but the mindset is still there when it comes to putting in the work and the effort. The academic performance suffers when a student feels isolated and they don't feel like they're a part of the community. They're not going to go to their work study job to make the extra money if they're feeling like they're not happy at the institution. So it all boils down to in a lot of ways the mental health and that sense of belonging component. So I would say that I'm going to revisit your stop doing question here as part of this this innovative strategies is things like early alert systems and just standalone text message nudges are not necessarily these are not innovative strategies. And these are things that data show don't necessarily work on their own. Or is it bad to track a student's attendance in class? Clearly not. That's not a bad thing. But waiting until they're not in class 6 weeks in a row to be reaching out to them to say, hey, we think you might be in trouble. Here's some resources is not the right thing to do either, right? I think it's strategies that are more proactive in nature and in front of students more consistently are the things that are going to help to drive success over the near and the long term.
I'm really energized by this conversation, in part because everything that Aaron and Gil are saying are so many of the things that we're seeing at my institution and things that I'm experiencing in the work that I do. I also found it really interesting that Aaron mentioned intramural volleyball. That's the second time this week that I've heard somebody say intramural volleyball as a strategy for this is why I stayed. This is how I felt like I belonged. So clearly the answer is intramural volleyball.
Bump, set, spike, my friend. Bump, set, spike.
That's it. That's it. If you don't have it, you got to get it. You'll see a retention spike. So I wanted to just touch on a couple of things that we do specifically at our institution. And I want to tie them to the fact that Shiro's onboarding success pyramid has two keys that are related to relationships. So one of the things that we noticed on our campus was that students that were leaving were often the most outreached to. They had connected with the most resources. They'd had the most meetings on their schedules, all of those kinds of things. But every single one of those, or the majority of those outreaches or those connections to resources, were reactive to a problem, which is a lot of kind of what Gil was saying just now too. Most of the time, the first time a student encounters our Center for Student Success is when something has already gone wrong. They haven't been attending early, they've got a bad mid-semester grade, they didn't register on time, all of those kinds of things. It's very reactive, and it's reactive to something negative. So one of the things that we implemented this year on our campus was for our incoming first year students to have a summer check-in with resources on campus who are typically the ones that they hear from in a negative fashion, so that their first point of contact with us is not that negative reactionary thing. It's a positive interaction. We're talking about their schedule. We're talking about what they're excited about for fall. We're asking any questions that they might have or any outstanding information that they're missing. And it's sort of serving as an earlier handoff from the admissions and enrollment side of things into the student success, student support side of things. And it gives us that chance to get our faces and our names and our services and all of those kinds of things in front of them long before they're ever in trouble. And of course, this is the first time we're trying this, so we have no idea if it's going to work. We have some measures in place to try to see how it's happening. But it's the first time that we're making that really concerted effort to be one-on-one with our incoming students before they belong. We're fortunate in that we can scale that and make that happen with the resources that we have. I know a lot of other institutions may not be able to, but I think that ability to start developing those relationships in a positive fashion before it becomes a, hey, this is happening negatively for you, come see me. If we can say, hey, come and see me, I want to get to know you, then we can be alongside them when the challenges come versus reacting to the challenges when they come.
Shiro, can I add to that? I really like that way that John put that, and I think that's something I've been really trying to encourage on our campus. That we haven't done it yet, but I'd like to go there, right? Which is really kind of developing this sense of a transition team for an individual student. I would love to get us to a point where we are like, when the student deposits with us, we send them something that says, congratulations and welcome, and here's your transition team, right? And you list like a little picture of a financial aid counselor and the person's name, right? And a picture of someone from the business office or the accounts, student accounts, and a picture of someone from housing. It's like, this is your team, right? And because I think what ends up happening is we still work in this old mindset where we think of it as a handoff between like the enrollment area and other areas of campus. And I think handoff kind of is abrupt, right? And it doesn't match very well. And I think what you want instead is like this on-ramp, right? Where I keep thinking about it as like, okay, in March, 70% or maybe even 80% of their communication should come from enrollment, with maybe 20 or 30% from the other areas on campus. But by May, it should be 50-50. And by, July, it should be 80-20 in the other direction, right? It ought to be this, the student shouldn't feel this sense of being handed off and like, jumping around. They should feel this nice smooth on-ramp where it's like, oh, wow, I'm making other connections on campus. And I don't feel like I just have one person I can talk to in the admissions office. I feel like I have all these people that are on my team and that are here to support me. And I think that, we're a long way from that, I think, in lots of places, lots of campuses across the country. But I think ideally that's where we need to get to.
Gil, do you have something you want to say?
No, I have nothing more to add on that point for sure.
Gotcha.
Mic drop.
I just had, Aaron, oh man, I was thinking about your comment earlier around you need more backers, or focusing on why the student has a good reason to stay. And relating that to John's question around like, one-on-one conversations, like, do you think that the type of questions that counselors and anyone working during that onboarding process should be asking should be different? Like, hey, like, what do you like about, being on campus? Or what excites you about XYZ institutions? Like, is the framework of the question itself like need shifting? Like, I'm not, I don't work in the weeds anymore, but I'm just curious if like that's like a micro element of the changes you're trying to make. Would that be an example of that?
I love that, Shiro. In part, like, we talked very deliberately about when we're doing these onboarding conversations about not ever saying, do you have any questions? Because there's sort of an implication then that, well, I should have questions, and if I don't have questions, what am I missing? And why don't I have questions? Does everybody else have questions? Those kinds of things. And so we've focused a lot more on, hey, let's take a look at your schedule. Do these classes align with what you thought you were going to be taking? Do you have any changes you'd want to make? What are you most excited to experience when you get here to campus in the fall? What are you looking forward to about living on campus? And so we're really focusing on those positive things and what will be unique to their experience, what they are expecting. And I think what that's done is led them to say, well, I actually do have this one question. Can we talk about this? Which I think has been really fruitful. Whereas if we had put them on the spot and said, do you have any questions? I don't think they would be as comfortable coming out and saying, yes, I do. Here's what my question is. But starting with those, what are you excited about? What are you looking forward to? Leads them into the, hey, now I have this question. Can we talk about this?
Kira, can I add to that again? I think that's, absolutely the way to go is, and your question I think is great, which is, are we asking the right questions, right? I mean, I keep thinking about, again, I think something that would be fantastic for students. We're so right now, there's so much focus on mental health for students. And, that's such a big contributor to this idea of retention and persistence. And yet we don't take advantage of some of what we know about, mental health processes, right? And just being mentally healthy in general, right? We treat it always only as a crisis. And I think we could learn a lot from something like I've been thinking a lot about, there's a theory out there called acceptance and commitment theory, right? Where the best thing to do when you have really big challenges in your life is, number one, you accept what they are and that they're, sort of separate from you. But that the important part is that you make commitments about the rest of your life and what you'd like it to look like, right? And I've thought a lot about how this could apply to our students, right? When they come in, are we asking them, all right, take a minute. I'd like you to think about, over these next 4 years, what would you like your relationship with your parents to look like? right? And the student might say, well, I'd like to develop a better relationship with my parents where I feel like we have a good level of trust and I'm able to communicate with them more as a peer than, as a child, right? And you walk them through those different areas and say, okay, what do you want for your career, right? And what do you want for your friendships and those kinds of things? And so you help them sort of visualize a values-based sort of success, right? What does this look like for you? And then what happens again is when the student has a bad day and something goes wrong, you can say, hey, we can accept that something goes wrong, but look, you're moving towards things that are important to you and that you're committed to. And don't let this one bad day throw you off from the things that you've committed to in your life and the values that you are looking for, right? And I feel like that is the kind of anchoring we need to be doing with students, right? Is saying, what do you see for your life? What do you want to visualize for your life? What does success look like for you at the end of 4 years? What does it look like, right? And if we could kind of point to students towards that vision, then again, the bad days don't kill it, right? You're saying, no, you're so much more than that. You are making, plans for your life that might serve you forever, right? And you're teaching them this valuable skill that they can then do for themselves when they leave you, right? As they can say, okay, I need to sit down and reevaluate what my values are for my life and make sure I'm moving towards them. So I think that would be incredibly helpful.
Yeah, I think it all boils down to empathy for the student's position and what's going on in their life, right? And I feel like one of the things that it's always, quote unquote, always been that way is students have to live into our processes, and our processes are, that handoff from enrollment to student affairs and academic affairs is an abrupt one, because student affairs and academic affairs, the position is, well, they have to learn how to be adults and they have to follow the processes and follow the rules. Well, reality, once you're an adult, there's always exceptions to the rules, and there's always ways you can make things work and figure things out. But I think everyone values good customer service and values good, response from people and proactive outreach from people, right? And so I think it boils down to, again, what is our approach and how do we operationalize all of those things? And if we can put together a plan to do what Aaron said, I think that's a huge step in the right direction, because then you're helping your team to prioritize the students that they have to respond to or reach out to, because you can't call or text every single student one by one at most institutions, right? Even institutions with 500 students, it's a tall task for the size of teams that we have to accomplish these types of strategies. So it's really, setting benchmarks and goals, tracking the outcomes, stopping doing what's not working, doubling down on what is. And I think that there's that type of mindset needs to permeate through, because we got to get out of the transactional push notification mindset of student retention and bring it to more of a proactive and a empathetic type of an approach in support of student success.
Can I 100% agree with what Gil just said? I mean, I think we are so focused sometimes on doing this in a technocratic way, right? That if we just get the right gizmos or the right, kind of things in place, that it's going to work, right? And I think so much of it really is about, again, not to go to use an analogy, maybe like a health analogy, right? Right now, I think so many of our retention practices are focused on, okay, when we see a student who gets sick, how do we triage that, right? And I feel like if we could take a giant shift and kind of say, we would be so much better off if, on like in a health way, if you're saying, hey, it's great to eat healthy, make sure you exercise, right? Manage your stress, watch out for and those are the kinds of things that like we need to be doing on the front end, right? Is saying, look, here's how you take care of your life. Here's how you make a big transition. Here's how you move towards adulthood. Here's how you, start to manage your own stuff a little bit. And that way you're getting those good behaviors in before you get to the point where students are sort of, getting sick and need a doctor's attention, right? And I think that's the transactional method that, is treating the sick person. And we need to get to a proactive relational kind of a way of interacting with students that treats the healthy person and helps preventing them from getting sick.
Thank you. No, I love this part of the discussion. I'm going to just slightly move on just for purpose of time, but I loved all the examples. I also wanted to point out, John actually shared this strategy that he wanted to try out at their institution. And I believe, if you're in the audience and you're thinking like, oh, like I just don't have the budget or the resources right now. If I remember correctly, like you're prioritizing this program with not like a huge increase in resources, right? You're working pretty much with what you had in the years past as well, right?
Yeah, I think that's been pretty key for us, is to take a look at our resource allocation and think
Mhm.
about ways in which we can sort of shift things over, or ways that we can do it at no cost without rebuilding or re-resourcing some things. So a couple of examples, like we have a couple of scholarship cohorts that we manage out of my office that are really targeted towards certain populations that we're trying to grow, and that have been historically underrepresented at our institution. But what we can do with that program is scale it in such a way that the resources and the programming and things that we're delivering to those scholarship students, we can replicate that for other underrepresented populations without having to throw full cost scholarships at those students. These are students that are already at the institution, and so rather than thinking of it as this large scale program, we can just piggyback on the things that we are doing with the scholarship cohorts. We can replicate those programming opportunities, those social opportunities, those support networks, all of those types of things. And in some ways, those scholarship cohorts become pilot programs for us that we can look to scale, or we can look to reallocate resources across in a different way that again sort of targets these other underrepresented populations that we're not hitting, or members of those populations that aren't recipients of those scholarships directly. So that's one of the ways that we've been trying to think through this. We've used it in our orientation programming in ways to think about how were we thinking about these historically underrepresented populations previously. How do we rethink that without creating a whole new program, and just do it within the framework of what we're already doing? It's been pretty critical for us to think about that ways, because more money is not coming for us. We're not getting more FTE added to our office. And so we have to think about what are we already doing that we can then scale for other groups of students.
That's great. And that actually parlays. I'm going to skip over a question or two just because I think, we've kind of covered it slightly while answering this question, which is one around what do you believe community adds? Sorry. What is the impact of building belonging community? I feel like we had a good grasp on it, so I'm just going to skip over this question to 5. And kind of with what John was talking about right now, if you had unlimited resources, what would be the next one thing you would try to help increase student retention or persistence? And maybe John, I'll pass it back to you, because you just talked about one strategy, and maybe you can double down on what you talked about now.
Yeah, so I mean, thinking about it specifically in the way that this question is asked, like I think if we had unlimited resources, the one thing that we would do is greater amounts of communication and support with families, with parents, with guardians, with student support systems outside of the institution. We started thinking about it a little bit differently a couple of years ago about how we're not recruiting individuals, we're recruiting families, we're recruiting communities. We're not retaining individuals, we're retaining communities, we're retaining families. I think for us, being a historically predominantly white institution, one of the few private institutions in our immediate area, I think there's some perceptions about who we are and what types of students we serve, and those are mostly wrong. But if we don't build those systems of trust with the people beyond the individual students that we recruit, we're not really making headway into those communities. So, thinking about it from that framework, we need better communication with people's parents. We need better communications with counselors at the high schools, or with community organizations that serve those populations that we're trying to grow and that have been historically underrepresented at our campus. So I would love more resources for that, for sure.
Thanks for sharing that.
I think the interesting thing for me is that a lot of what I would like to do, or I think a lot of institutions could do, especially smaller institutions, doesn't cost a lot of money. It really is mostly about cultural change, which isn't expensive, but it's just hard, right? It's just difficult to encourage people to do things in a really different way. So, certainly you could always, add people who were focused on this. You could always it'd be great to give people sort of training on what questions to ask students when they're kind of connecting with them. So I think those would all be really good uses of resources. But again, I think a lot of it is shifting the approach and maybe reorganizing some areas of your campus that they're just stuck in old models and old structures, right? And right now there are dividing lines between divisions that make sense to us internally, but they make no sense to students, right? They cannot understand why my office would pass them off to another office when they just need a question answered, right? And so for a student, they don't care who answers the question or whose jurisdiction it is. They just need the answer, right? And so I feel like there are areas within our campuses where if we could change the culture of the way we approach it, and we could get that culture to be a little bit unified around a couple of really key concepts, right? So again, for me and my campus, I'd love it if when students went in for an advising appointment, people would say, hey, who do you go to when you have challenges? Who's your mentor person on campus, right? Or what are you involved in right now? What's your favorite activity? What are you doing? What do you feel like you belong with, right? If I could get everybody on my campus to be asking that, and students asking other students, how to do that, and, make it part of our orientation process, you wouldn't need a lot of money to do that. But you do need culture change. And I think that's sometimes even harder to get than money.
Yeah, I think the message here is, while it sounds nice to have unlimited resources, you don't necessarily need unlimited resources. You need to use your resources more effectively, which sounds like a little bit of a cop out but I would say that's the reality, because the reality is that you're not going to get unlimited resources. So we need to be more creative and think about changing the culture around this topic. My answer was going to be pay raises for everyone on the team and make college free, right? Unlimited resources, great, no big deal, but not going to happen, right? I think at the end of the day, we need to think through, and it's, again, it goes back to prioritizing, and it goes back to developing processes. So I would invest in analyzing the right data and utilizing those sorts of things, and it may lead to a tech-enabled solutions from a vendor, or it may lead to having to identify resourcing for the staff. But at the end of the day, it goes back to the question from before about what would we stop doing. Stop doing the stuff that we can't track, that we're spinning our tires on, that we know doesn't work, and not do more of it just because if we feel like we'll do more, we're going to get better result. That's the definition of insanity, right? So let's stop being insane and start thinking more strategically about the resources that we do have, because we're not going to get unlimited resources.
Moving on here, we got a couple of minutes here. So I know we just had this conversation around working more with what you have. If you have experience for championing for more resources, how did you go about it? Or maybe it's not resources in this case, in implementing change. How did you go about that? I think John actually shared some examples around, hey, we looked at data, right? We looked at data and we saw there was no data, or we saw when there was no data, we asked for data and then we shifted results because we found that data. Are there any other examples here that anyone would like to share? We got a few minutes here left.
I mean, I think that's a great summary of the point, Shiro, is that it's not necessarily about championing more resources, although when you need something, ask for it, right? If you don't ask, right? That's what I always tell my kids. That's what I've always lived by is if people don't know that's what you need, you're not going to get it, right? So it doesn't hurt to ask for these things. But to Aaron's point, it's more about championing for change. And if you can champion for change, I do feel like there's a certain level, and John and Aaron might disagree with me on this, but there's also a certain level of, there are some folks where no amount of data is going to change their mind, because it's their gut reaction, their perspective of things that the way it's always been done, or what their comfort level is. So even with all of the data in the world, that's not going to change their mind. You've got to change their feelings, right? And you've got to change their perspective. And so that's sharing of anecdotal stories of how things work, and connecting them with students that are positively impacted by these approaches. Because, you know, Shiro and I come from the ed tech side of the desk, where we in marketing and dealing with people. No amount of data sometimes convinces people to make that decision. A lot of times it's the feeling and the story that they need to hear too. So sharpen your storytelling pencil a little bit, because it's not just the data that's gonna lead change. It's gonna be the message around that data as well.
Thanks, Gil.
Sure. I think that's, part of the challenge in making that pitch is to understand that the people who need to help make that decision speak different languages, right? Like, you might go to a CFO, and the data will really convince them, right? The revenue data, they'll be like, wow, we've really got to make this a priority. But that same argument is not going to work with your student development area or academic affairs. And so having to bring sort of all the arguments to the table at the same time, that's part of what makes it a challenging ask, right? Is to say, look, everybody benefits from doing this. And it speaks all of your languages, right? I mean, I think that's the real challenge.
Thanks, Aaron. Okay, great. If anyone has any questions now, throw them into the chat. I did want to share a quick resource that we'll be emailing to you with the recording tomorrow. So I talked about the onboarding success pyramid we created. That's published on a white paper. I'll be sending the document to everyone who registered. It's 21 pages, I believe. So we'll be sending the PDF to you ungated tomorrow. So be on the lookout for that email. Let's check the Q&A again real quick. I think we did such a good job. People don't have questions, which is interesting. Let's see. Yeah, no questions right now in the queue. So that's good, because we don't have that much time left. So it worked out. Thank you so much to our panelists for joining here today. Gil, John, Aaron, thank you so much for joining. And thanks for everyone for tuning in that attended as well. Awesome discussion. It might be one of my favorite ones that I've had so far. So thanks everyone for pouring your heart out and being transparent with us. Really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.